All right, joining me for another episode of Kabul'd Together is Kristy Pirano, my co-host of the show. Kristy, welcome back.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to be back so soon, but there's been some really upsetting news out of Canada, and I'm just gonna share my screen here just so y'all can have a look at what exactly I'm talking about. But it's as I'm pulling that up, Kristy, do you want to explain just to people what's going on that has caught my attention, has made decide that I want to do this show because I think it should be popping up on screen right now.
Yeah, so I think the from the perspective of U.S. organizations are also facing the same issue, but like what you're referring to is a story about a Canadian organization that was providing food and safe houses for a couple thousand at-risk Afghans who worked for the Canadian government and are trying to get Canadian visas that then ran out of money and closed the safe houses and said, "All right, you guys are on your own now."
Yeah, no, it's really upsetting because as you can see here, yeah, Kabul safe houses that are providing refuge to more than 1,700 Afghan interpreters and their families closed on Friday, and there were repeated requests for the federal government to respond and to pick up the funding, and they not only did they not do that, they didn't even respond, like they didn't even say anything, just let it happen. And
Yeah.
many people in these camps ended up going back to their homes, where they are probably going to be hunted down by the Taliban. They were safe in these camps in Kabul. Now they've been forced out and they have to go back home, and where the Taliban could very well be waiting for them. And I cynically joke, the Canadian Liberals turning away refugees since 1939. It's upsetting because I mean it seriously, because Canada during the 1930s had one of the worst records of any country on admitting refugees. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was actually an early admirer of Adolf Hitler, and so it's just something that upsets me as a Canadian because once again we seem to have not learned from history. No one in this world seems to have learned from history, but especially Canada. That when you turn away refugees, bad things will happen to them, and morally speaking, blood is on their hands if any of these people are killed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's really shameful that Western governments, US and Canada and others, made promises to Afghans. And like in our legislation to establish a visa path for Afghans who aided the US, it's called the Special Immigrant Visa. There's a proposition that says that the visas have to be processed in 9 months, and in reality, they take years. And courts have said this is not legal, but the State Department hasn't done anything to speed it up. And there's also a part of the legislation says that if the Afghan is at risk, the U.S. needs to provide safety. But the U.S. left like 80,000 or so SIV applicants and their families behind. And actually getting the exact number is difficult. There had been, I think, about 80,000 applicants and family members, and then some of those were evacuated. I don't know exactly what percentage. At one point, they estimated that maybe 10 or 15,000 of the evacuees were people that had pending SIV cases or had special immigrant visas. But then there were still like at least 65,000 SIV applicants and their families. And then there's a whole new cohort of people who recently found documentation realizing that they couldn't remain in Afghanistan anymore. So there's a whole new influx of SIV applicants that has now like really overwhelmed the State Department's processing of SIV visas. And it's the same situation in Canada. Like Canada had, well, actually, I think Canada doesn't have the equivalent of a special immigrant visa, but like a few years ago, they had naturalized some Afghans that worked with the Canadian government, and then they basically just did nothing for several years about Canadians who helped, or Afghans who helped Canadian forces. That they had a visa program, I think back in 2014 or something, and that was over, and then they just didn't really do anything. And basically the US presence in Afghanistan made it stable enough that it wasn't enough of an emergency for anyone to do anything. Obviously that has come to an end, and now the Taliban are ruling the roost and hunting down and murdering people. And it's really hard to even get information on how many people have been killed. I mean, I do think most of them are still alive, but in hiding. But it's not like there's free speech in Afghanistan, so it's really it's impossible to know how many people have been assassinated by the Taliban. But we definitely have documentation that it is happening. There was also just a few days ago, there was a story of a women's rights activist and a few of her friends that were killed through a fake evacuation. So the Taliban called them with someone who was, I think, an English speaker and said, yeah, look, we're saving women's rights activists, like report to this safe house and you'll be evacuated. So they reported there and they were murdered and like dumped in a well. And so that kind of made the rounds on Afghan social media a few days ago. So that just underscores that these people really are at risk, and all of the stuff the Taliban is saying about, oh no, we're not retaliating, that's the official position of the leadership. I think the fact that the leadership is claiming that means that they are taking efforts to kind of tamp down what is happening, but they are in no means in control of their forces. And it's not even clear that the leadership means what they're saying about, like, no, we're not killing people. I think
They could just be straight up lying.
Yeah, no, I suspect what they're telling the world is one thing and what they're telling their fighters is something different. Yeah, but even if you believe their claim that they are trying to keep this from happening and they're providing amnesty and stuff, even if you believe that, which I don't, there's still the issue that they are not in control of all the factions and all the fighters, and so they're taking personal revenge on these people, that if they can, and in many cases they have some sort of prior personal relationship with them. It's like if this was a judge who sentenced their brother to go to Bagram jail, and now the brother's been sprung from jail, and so what does he want to do to the judge that he knows had like sentenced his family to prison? Or also, like, if someone is a linguist and they know that this person is a linguist and this person was helping the US military arrest Taliban, like, it doesn't matter what the Taliban in Kabul says about forgiving US military interpreters. Those people who know that person and know that they work for the US and know that they helped put people in their area in prison are not gonna just, forgive and move on.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to pull up to see if I can find the article that said this, but I remember reading a really horrific story about a interpreter, I think from this Shiite group that has been persecuted by the Taliban for a long time, and when the safe house is closed, he said that he was considering turning himself over to the Taliban so that they would kill him but spare his family, and so.
Yeah, it's just such a heartbreaking situation. I mean, I'm in contact with people also where the Taliban has arrested their brother and is torturing the one brother to try to get the other one to come back and turn himself in. And yeah, and I don't know that they get so desperate that they think about, like, can they just, sacrifice themselves to save their family? But the Taliban, they have no honor, so it's not like that's necessarily going to work. And I mean, I've had this discussion with a combat interpreter I've been trying to help for quite a while, because sometimes he gets so discouraged and it's like, well, maybe I should just turn myself in and then they'll spare my family. It's like, well, not necessarily. I mean, and also a friend of mine who's really involved in the Afghan evacuation stuff as well, he is in contact with a guy who has threat letter, like, specific to his kids as well. And so it's like, we will kill your whole family. It's not just like, well, we want to kill the husband and the kids are all right. So if someone is a high enough profile person, then yeah, the Taliban is also going to target the family, not only the, like, principal applicant. So so the problem is the Taliban has no honor, and also in some cases they really do want to kill the whole family, not just one family member.
I sometimes wonder, like, how can this possibly get any worse? And every time we meet Kristy, it seems that it just always just seems to find a way to just get worse. This is a slow moving disaster for the West. And I have been reading. I read something like a couple weeks ago that said that the Taliban that there's a terrorist group that using Taliban children might plan a terrorist attack on the United States in the next 6 months. And do you think if that could happen, could we be back where we started like over 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think we absolutely could end up back in Afghanistan, and there's also rumors that, well, like, or maybe intelligence would be a better way to say it than rumors, that ISIS is growing even from defectations from the Taliban. It's like some of the more radical Taliban did want to actually see like mass public executions of people who'd worked with the former government or the US, and leadership has kept it on the down low. So there have been killings, but they've kind of been trying to quietly kill people here and there, but not like make a massive public spectacle. And so then the Taliban that wanted that to be they wanted huge public executions. So now some of the more extreme Taliban are going and affiliating with ISIS. There was also a bombing in the hospital that is claimed to be ISIS, and I don't know if I don't know for sure if that is confirmed that it was ISIS-K, but that's the claim, is that there was a suicide bombing in a hospital in Kabul just a few days ago, and it's claimed to be ISIS-K. So that's the other issue, is that first of all, there is absolutely zero reason to believe that the Taliban meant any of the stuff they said about not attacking the West, because the US and the West made a ton of concessions and in the Doha agreement, and then basically every small thing that the Taliban did agree to, they proceeded to break within weeks. The only exception being not attacking the West, which is the one thing they didn't yet have the resources to do. So it's like, do we really believe that when they broke all the other concessions they made, they actually plan to keep the only one that we really, the one that our government touted is like, oh, hey, this is why this is going to work, because they're just going to leave us alone. We're just going to let them murder some Afghans and everything will be fine. So I think it's extremely short-sighted. And now, like, the Biden administration did get caught off guard on how fast things fell, but they're saying, oh, well, we thought it would take at least a year before Kabul fell. It's like, well, why was that an acceptable strategy to say, oh, well, we think it's going to be a year before terrorists are running this country? Like, why do we ever think it's acceptable to have a country run by terrorists? And so, yeah, they were surprised that it took like 2 weeks instead of at least 4 months, but it's like, well, why were we planning on a strategy that had terrorists running a country within a year or two? And it ended up being a couple of weeks instead of a couple of years. And then they said, oh, but at least it will take a couple of years before they have the capacity to attack the United States. And again, it's like, first of all, there is more to foreign policy than just do they have the capability of killing Americans on American soil? That's a very like US, short-sighted and US centric view that just totally doesn't even address your moral responsibility. But then even if you even aside from that, the moral responsibilities and the like caring about 40 million people in Afghanistan aspect, even if you really do only care about the West, it's still very short-sighted to implement a policy that could result in terrorist attacks against the US within a year or two. And given that Afghanistan collapsed within weeks instead of months, I mean, it's quite likely that they are on track for having the capacity to attack the US a lot sooner than the official estimates were. And then you also have the fact that it's not just the Taliban, it's also ISIS and Al Qaeda, and which sometimes they fight each other and sometimes they don't. But I mean, now you have so many different terrorist organizations operating in Afghanistan, and we don't really have a good way to address it, despite what the Biden administration says about like over the horizon stuff. I mean, so far the very touted like, oh, we got rid of this car bomb that was going to attack on Kaya, actually an aid worker and his kids that they blew up, and now the Pentagon, after their investigation, said that they decided they didn't do anything wrong. It's like, well, yeah, the Pentagon investigated their own mistake and said, oh, nothing to see here. So that's how that's going with like over the horizon, like we end up just killing innocent people instead of actually terrorists.
Right. And you think that conservatives like and Republicans would be able to mount an effective criticism of the Biden's actions in Afghanistan, Biden administration's actions in Afghanistan. unfortunately, their attention seems to be turned right now to Sesame Street, and and Big Bird. Like, this is the conservative. You can say what you will about the conservatives in Canada. At least they know how to stay on message.
Yeah, and I think it does depend on. I think there are some Republicans that, in my opinion, should have been more vocal about this issue while Trump was president, but have been pretty consistently vocal about it, like in a tamped down way during Trump's presidency, and now in a pretty forward way now that Biden is president. But yeah, I would agree with you that Republicans are not entirely staying on message. But there was actually a hearing about, there was some sort of a State Department oversight hearing that pretty much turned into a grilling session on Afghanistan. And there were, and some of the congressmen like Peter Maher of, actually I don't remember what state.
Peter Maher of Michigan.
Yeah, he has been very vocal about this issue, and he's an Afghan veteran. Adam Kinzinger has been vocal about it. So and I think those guys, at least Peter Maher did ask questions.
I'm going to say something, like, because I was a fan of Justin Amash when he was in Congress. Peter Maher is a major upgrade over Justin Amash. I'm sorry, Justin, my man. I like you, but I don't think you get what, I just don't think you get it here.
Yeah, I think Peter Maher has, I believe it's his first term, but so far I have been really happy with what he's been doing. Like, not that I'm going to agree with him on everything, but like, he's willing to think independently. I mean, he did, I believe, vote in favor of Trump's impeachment, which was obviously not politically expedient for a young Republican congressman. And I think because he was willing to hold Trump accountable when the rubber met the road, or actually it would be his second term now, because he was like willing to hold Trump accountable and the rubber met the road, it makes it a little bit less of empty hypocrisy when he criticizes the Biden administration, because at least he was willing to criticize his own party as well.
Yeah, and
there are plenty of Republicans though that had very little to say about this issue when Trump was president, that are now very vocal about how we can't abandon our allies. And some of these are people that, me and my friends had met with them and previously asked them to take action, and they had not really done anything.
Yeah. There's also the MAGA wing of the Republicans, like the Steve Bannon wing, who basically are saying that this is the best thing that Biden has ever done. Yeah.
To pull out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, like the Bannon, Tulsi Gabbard, wing, like, of the I don't know if it's specifically of the Republicans. I don't know how Republican these people really are, but I've seen a contingent of I guess like hardcore Trumpists. So I guess who basically said that this is one of the best things that Biden did, because they believe, again, in an isolationist foreign policy, and I think the kind of people who I'm talking about, right, Kristy?
Yeah, I think you have on the far right and on the far left, they end up with very similar foreign policy views. The far left kind of has the view that any American intervention is inherently imperialistic and is bad, and then the far right has the view that, well, if someone is not an American, or in many cases like a white American, we don't really care about them. So but it's both, in both cases it's an equally damaging, not that there is obviously a balance between being too involved in world affairs and not involved enough, but I think the isolationism, that was popular. The U.S. is trying to stay out of world wars and just kind of like, well, we're going to be neutral here, or we're going to not get involved, and then eventually was pushed to get involved in World War II. But yeah, I think it is equally. I think that both the far right and the far left like the isolationism, and I think it ends up being the middle that says, let's come up with a sensible foreign policy, and ends up being the extremes that are really kind of self-centered, self-centered and short-sighted, I would say, to just be like, well, we don't really care what happens to the rest of the world. We're just going to do our thing here in America.
Yeah. Case in point, just this past week, the House of Representatives voted on a resolution to condemn Cuba for their human rights abuses, suppressing dissent and calling on the release of political prisoners. That resolution passed 382 to 40. And that means a sizable chunk of Democrats. This includes every member of the squad, AOC, Cori Bush, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, and Ayanna Pressley were all no votes on this resolution. And that is absolutely, and again, like, how do you vote no on something like that? How do you vote no on the Cuban on condemning human rights abuses and calling for the release of political prisoners? And Thomas Massey, a congressman from Kentucky, who's the supposed champion of liberty, he voted present on this resolution. This to me should have been a slam dunk. But go ahead, you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I think Massey I think he's very libertarian and very much, and I think he is coming from that isolationist perspective of they're a sovereign nation and it's none of our business what they do. But yeah, it's not like they were voting on invading Cuba to release political prisoners. They were just voting on making a statement that, oh, by the way, you really shouldn't be imprisoning and torturing your political opponents. So please stop. Yeah, so I mean, I think that should have been a no-brainer for everyone in Congress. Like, if we are going to claim in America to have any high moral ground, being willing to say that countries should not be persecuting political dissidents, being willing to call out countries when they are committing genocide, that should be a no-brainer. And that's become more and more, I mean, Democrats, like the liberal Democrats, have become more and more comfortable with just failing to call out human rights. And then they will turn around and say, they're all about human rights. And like, Ilhan Omar claims to be all about human rights, but she's never seen a resolution she will anything ever condemning Turkey for all of their human rights abuses, including their past genocide. She will always vote, like, she will always support Turkey. And even if she's like one of a handful of people in Congress doing that. And it's like, if you are really concerned about human rights, you're not going to be silent about countries' human rights abuses just because you're cozy with their president. And yeah, I think that's one of the things. It's just hypocrisy that to say that you care about human rights and then be unwilling to take even basic votes in support of human rights.
Yeah, there was a resolution on the Armenian. I think what Kristy's referring to was a vote a couple years back on recognizing the Armenian genocide, and Ilhan Omar quite famously voted present on that resolution. Again, no, she was not the only one to do that by any means. Paul Gosar also voted present, but to me, it's like resolutions like this that are absolute no-brainers. Like, how can you be against this? And yet you have people who somehow perform the mental gymnastics necessary to not vote yes on a resolution like this. Like, and I get it. There are people like Noam Chomsky who say, like, no matter what happens, it's America's fault. And I just was hoping that we wouldn't have these views in Congress, but alas, I think this is I don't think that this type of thinking can really win outside of probably the bluest of cities. But it's upsetting that like there is a growing contingent in Congress on both the right and the left that believes that essentially believes that human rights don't matter, and that America cannot be possibly a force for good. There are just as many people on the right who believe this as on the left, and this includes, again, the Paul Gosars of Congress.
Yeah, and I think for them it's just a lack of concern about anything in the America First stuff that President Trump popularized, was just kind of, some of that is just rooted in a disregard for what happens in the rest of the world, and just a feeling that, well, if it's not within our borders, then we don't care. Right. And I think that's both a complete lack of empathy for what's happening in the world and also a short-sighted, because it's not like we can just plop a glass dome over America where the rest of the world doesn't matter. I mean, we do have, legally or not, people are going to come to the US. And so and also, like, if these terrorist groups have the resources to shoot an intercontinental ballistic missile, then it's right. Fine and all up here, or they're North Korea or Afghanistan or wherever, they can still get you.
But I think with Ilhan Omar, and I'm just me being cynical. This is me just being a cynical Jew. But I believe that with Ilhan Omar's vote, against the Armenian, recognizing the Armenian genocide or present on it, there was no way she could twist it to criticize Israel for it. So there was no benefit to her in voting for the resolution. Like, this is just the cynic in me talking. I mean, it's not just like her talking about Israel. It's the fact that she tweeted that support for Israel was quote unquote all about the Benjamins, and
Yeah.
Rashida Tlaib like saying, accusing members of Congress who are pro-Israel of quote unquote dual loyalty. Those two things are as you I think as people have said, are anti-Semitic canards, and I think that is something that goes into that kind of thinking. And what I've heard essentially is that on the far extremes of both sides seem to agree on one thing, one of those things is that the Jews are bad. So I guess I've been conditioned to believe that the extremes of both sides are bad for us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of foreign policy, and a lot of other policies. And also, I think instead of trying to come up with good policy to actually deal with America's enemies, they tend to use very inflammatory rhetoric about the other party, which is, I think, damaging to democracy. It's like you can disagree with someone's policy positions, but when you're constantly saying that, oh, we're the only real Americans, it's like they're sowing civil strife in the US intentionally to try to gain politically from it. And they're not saying, look, I can disagree with this person's policy positions, but we are going to try to compromise on important things as a country. It's like it's now a small percentage of members of Congress in either party that are really willing to, in many cases, join a bipartisan initiative because they don't want to be insufficiently partisan. But yeah, so I think that, I'm very concerned about the foreign policy and the anti-Semitism of both extremes, and also just how they both sort of encourage strife because they think they benefit politically from it, instead of encouraging civil discourse and compromise and the other things that make an effective democracy. Or we don't really have a democracy. We really have a democratically elected republic. But still, to maintain that more democratic system instead of a dictatorship, there has to be some ability to compromise between parties. And if we don't want to become the next Pakistan, where every time someone gets in power, where there's rampant corruption in all the parties, and every time one gets in power, they like imprison everybody in the other party, and that sort of thing happens in other countries. But we're going to lose our ability to have free and fair elections and peaceful transitions of power if both parties are going to continue down this road of like encouraging strife instead of encouraging civil discourse.
Did Biden ultimately sign the proclamation recognizing the Armenian genocide?
I actually don't remember. I believe he did, yeah, but I don't remember the details. But some of that was during the Trump. Some of those votes were during the Trump administration, though.
Right. I thought that the Biden campaign saying that he was going to do it. I don't think Trump ever said anything about it.
Yeah, that's right. I think Congress passed something when Trump was president.
Congress, that was the resolution that we were just talking about earlier.
Yeah.
This is actually easily verifiable. But anyway, anything else happening? Oh yeah, there's an election in or whatever Nicaragua's calling an election.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yet Maria Salazar, a Republican congresswoman from Florida, has been vocal about the need for the U.S. to, not recognize the results of this election and to officially condemn what's happening in Nicaragua.
Yeah, well, I think basically all the people running against the president are in jail, so that's one way to make sure win an election is throw all your opponents in jail.
Yeah, a fair election would have probably seen Ortega get unseated.
Yeah,
anyway,
and that's why I wanted fair elections. I mean,
Anyway,
like he made sure it wasn't because he didn't want to lose power.
yeah, no, it's just I mean, it's I guess it's hard to not get depressed when talking about the state of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, and and like being involved in what's going on in Afghanistan has taken a huge mental toll on me and others that are involved in advocacy, because you're constantly hearing from people who believe they're going to die any day, and in some cases they will, and it's like we try to add them to lists of potential lists for evacuation, and a few people are getting out here and there, and then but people constantly think that if they just know a U.S. citizen, and if we were doing our job, we'd have them on a plane. It's like, well, the problem is there's tens of thousands of Afghans at risk, and there's maybe 1,000 or so getting out every week. I don't know what the exact numbers are. I mean, there are now like several. There are some flights every day out of Afghanistan. So there are charter flights that nonprofits are evacuating people by air. There's also, I mean, some that are working on alternative, like helping them legally cross borders and get visas at other places. So there is some of that going on, but the pace is so slow, and winter's coming, and Afghanistan is facing a massive starvation crisis. It's like half the country doesn't have food or a job, and the US has frozen assets because they don't recognize the Taliban, but then the world is just, I mean, Germany did say last week that they were going to provide more humanitarian aid, but the world is just kind of sitting here watching while half of Afghanistan is literally starving, including US and Canadian allies that do not even have like food and shelter, let alone protection from being murdered by the Taliban. So yeah, it's just a massive humanitarian crisis and now the Biden administration definitely wants to just kind of move on from Afghanistan. I think other countries in the world would probably also like to move on and not really talk about how many thousands of people they left behind to be killed by the Taliban.
They shouldn't get to. We shouldn't get to.
Yeah, and yeah, they should not get to, and that's the problem with the U.S. media, is they have a very short attention span. So for a while, Afghanistan was big news, and then people kind of moved on, and the media kind of moved on, and a lot of people don't even realize that there's any evacuations ongoing in Afghanistan because the media doesn't even talk about it very much. And I think there has been a little uptick in coverage on Afghanistan this last week. There was a letter that like all the female senators sent to the Biden administration about working to protect women's rights in Afghanistan. And there was a story about a father who sold his 9-year-old daughter to be able to have food to feed the rest of the family. And these kinds of like tragedies, and it's always disappointing. You'll always be disappointed in human nature if you like read comments on these stories, because people are like, oh, well, this has always just been happening in Afghanistan. It's like, well, that doesn't make it okay. And it's just an amazing amount of callousness. It's like, oh, well, gee, Afghan girls sold to 50-year-old men so their father can buy food for his other kids. Like, it's no big deal because it's always been happening. And it's just the incredible callousness towards a humanitarian disaster that the West contributed to.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at a map of countries that recognize the Armenian genocide. The United States does recognize it now. So the UK still doesn't, though. So anyone who's watching who has connections with Boris Johnson, maybe have a talk with someone in the government, maybe see if you can convince them to recognize it. And yeah, also anyone who maybe has connections with the Irish, Spanish, and Norwegian, Danish, and Finnish governments might also want to, and Australia and New Zealand, just people who might have connections in those governments who happen to stumble across this video, maybe have a talk with your leaders and maybe see if you can convince them. Because the only two countries on this map that actually seem to explicitly deny it are, no surprise, Turkey and Azerbaijan. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, no, I agree with everything you've said about Afghanistan. It's a moral failing on the part of the West. It's something we should not be allowed to look away from, and it's something that we should be doing everything that we can to help. And if you write your lawmakers, I've written my lawmakers for the first time this year, and They can be responsive when pressure's on. So do
Yeah,
whatever you
yeah,
can.
they need to hear from people. And the State Department claims that they're picking up efforts to evacuate people with the help of Qatar, and I mean, which is great, but it's really disgraceful that it has taken 2 months. Well, they have had a few flights. I think it's been 11 or so that I've heard of that have been evacuation flights that have been facilitated through Qatar. I mean, which is better than nothing, because that's, I guess if it's 300 per flight, then that's a little over 3,000 people. It's mainly been US citizens and green card holders and their family members. There have been some, I think there were some athletes, there were some American University students. I think there have been some special immigrant visa holders or applicants maybe, but I think very few on the official US evacuation flights. They're now claiming that they're going to start evacuating SAVs with visas, and then after that they're going to evacuate SAVs are like halfway through the process. But a lot of what they're just saying is that now that you're halfway through the process, you need to get yourself to a country that has a US embassy, except Pakistan and Uzbekistan don't really want to deal with SAV applicants, and Pakistan is really the only country that for most of them there's any reasonable chance of them being able to get to. So Afghanistan remains a death trap, and the State Department is just like, well, good luck getting out of a country with completely closed borders when you may or may not have a passport, with almost no countries actively issuing visas to Afghans. And by the way, you can't go to Pakistan, but find a way to get your interview. And it's really just, and then they will say, but this is of utmost importance to the US government. And they are still processing the special immigrant visas, which is good. They didn't just say, oh, well, all these applicants are going to die anyway, so why bother processing the visas? So, I mean, at least they're processing the visas, but it's still a disgrace that we're not seeing multiple flights a day facilitated through Qatar to get these people out of there. It's like one every week, or it's like one or two a week, which is really way slower than it needs to be.
Yeah.
And at least they should be taking actions to provide humanitarian support to people that are supposed to be eligible for evacuation. I mean, a lot of the reason some of these people that the US government is going to later evacuate and take credit for, the reason they're going to be alive is because of private people who donated their time and money and coordinated safe houses and food and stuff to try to keep these people alive. And then the US government will eventually evacuate them and then say, look, we kept our promise to these Afghans. It's like, well, yeah, but because of private individuals who sacrificed their time and money and to save these people, that when the US government just had a total dereliction of duty.
Yeah, and I think all of this is contingent upon, at this point, the mercy of the Taliban in allowing Kabul airport to keep operating, because there were plans that to have NATO or Turkey or someone continue to operate the airport, and that's just completely been abandoned because everyone's just gone. So it's really the Taliban that's just letting people leave the country by air from Kabul airport.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least it is possible. I mean, at least planes do fly again. But yeah, NATO was talking about doing an evacuation. And so at one point in early September, it was like, here's this, NATO is going to evacuate at-risk Afghans. And so far, I don't think any of that has really happened. I have heard from people that are in touch with the State Department about that they are trying to ramp up efforts. I mean, that is good that they are supposedly ramping up evacuation efforts through Qatar, but yeah, it's still, and I mean, so far I think the Taliban is sort of they're still trying to get access to their foreign assets and international recognition and stuff, so they're on really good behavior now, and they're still really bad, but they're trying to act like they're on good behavior, which is why this is working at all.
Yeah, I mean, we could keep going on and on and on about this, but I think that for the sake of both of our mental health, I think we should probably pause it here and pick this up sometime else. Kristy, where can everyone follow you? People know, but good to plug every time.
Yeah, my Twitter profile is at Kristy. My Twitter handle, sorry, is at Kristy Ferrano.
And I can be found on Twitter at Overlord Johnny. For Coupled Together, this is Jonathan and this is Kristy. We will see you next time.